The Weathermasters War. Chapter 1, Versailles, December 2nd, 1713. Weathermaster Ian Macpherson stood on the deck of the Pearl, gazing down the length of the Grand Canal, while the windows of the Chateau de Versailles lit up one by one against the darkening sky. The canal went nowhere, connected to nothing. It was a cross-shaped body of water, a mile on its long axis and almost that on its shorter, dug for decoration and a king's amusement. Models of ships lay at anchor, built to 1/4 scale, their tiny mast tops no higher than Pearl's quarterdeck. The Pearl floated at the intersection of the cross. She was a small ship, barely 100 feet from stem to stern, but this was still the only part of the canal deep enough to accommodate her draw. Bringing a ship into Versailles was always tricky. Ian watched as a Venetian gondola set out from the far end of the canal. The gondolier took long, slow strokes with the enormous oar, while the passenger fussed at him to hurry, and soon it came bumping up against the hull. It rocked as Lieutenant Ash leaned out to grasp the rope ladder. He hauled himself up, muttering to himself as he climbed, and Ian offered him a hand over the bulwark. "Evening, Lieutenant." "Where is everyone?" said Ash, looking around. The deck was almost deserted. "Come on, get your team together. He's coming." He turned to wave at the gondolier, dismissing him. Looking about again, he shook his head. "And where's that monk gotten to?" Ash hurried off into the officers' quarters without waiting for an answer, and Ian turned to climb the companionway to the quarterdeck. There he found his 2 apprentices, Josephus and Ariana, both looking resplendent in the fading light, in scarlet dress uniforms and plumed hats. "Ready?" he asked them. "Aye, sir." Ariana was fussing with a wisp of hair that had come loose in front of her eyes. "Hold still," Ian told her. He took the stray wisp and tucked it behind her ear. "There, that'll do." "As bad as being presented at court," she said. "I never thought I'd be the one hobnobbing with kings. This'll be a story to tell, all right." Ian stepped back to cast a critical eye over her uniform. "Precious little time for hobnobbing," he said. His Scots accent stood out from the English voices of the rest of the crew. "You'll have your jobs to do, that's all." He tugged at Josephus's lapels. "You look grand, the both of you. Just stand up straight when he comes aboard." "They're really going to crown him," said Josephus, shaking his head. "A Catholic king." Ian grinned. "The rightful king," he said. "A Scotsman and a Stuart, and never mind his religion." "I never thought I'd say it," said Josephus. "Not without another civil war." "And Parliament," said Ariana. "Parliament'll have to stomach it," said Ian. "The Queen wants him at her bedside when she passes. We deliver him, she blesses him with her dying breath, and Parliament'll find a way to make it look like it was their idea all the time. All of it without a shot being fired." He turned to look down at the main deck, where sailors were beginning to bustle about. "Come on now." The boatswain was shouting orders as they climbed down. Lanterns were lit. Men near the bow were fitting bars into the capstan, ready to raise the anchor, while others climbed up into the rigging. Ang Zhao, the ship's monk, emerged from the officers' quarters, along with his acolyte, a younger man named Chan. As Ian led his apprentices to stand by the rope ladder, Ang and Chan made their way to stand opposite. Ang held a threadbare blanket around his shoulders, over his orange robes. Together, monks and weathermasters formed the 2 pillars upon which the fortunes of the Avian East Asia Company were built, and most company captains tried to have them prominently displayed on formal occasions like this. The blanket was a discordant note. But the monk was outside the ship's hierarchy. One made allowances. Ian bowed to Ang, just a nod of the head, and Ang returned the gesture with a hint of a smile. Ash came running up to them again. He looked Ian up and down, adjusted the plume in Ariana's hat, and then turned to the monk. He exhaled quickly through his nose. "I hate that blanket," he said. "Wasn't the captain going to get you a proper woolen cape?" Ang gave a small shrug. Ian looked down the canal again and saw a crowd of people from the chateau gathered by the water. Another gondola, larger than the first, was pushing away from the bank. Ian counted 8 people aboard. "Never mind," said Ash. "Here they come." He turned to stand at rigid attention next to the acolyte. It took a few minutes for the second gondola to reach them, touching the Pearl's hull with a gentle thud. The first 2 men to appear over the bulwark were soldiers, though their jackets of pale blue silk were finer than most. Ian backed up a half step to make room as they flanked the rope ladder. A third person made his way up, a young man whose floppy hat sported half a dozen plumes and several large jewels. As the soldiers helped him over the rail, Ian and the others removed their own hats. Lieutenant Ash bowed deeply. "Monsignor, welcome aboard," he said. The Prince of Wales, James Francis Stewart, gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "Merci, Monsieur Ash." He turned to greet the others in turn. Ian bowed along with the rest. His pulse quickened. He'd been in the presence of royalty before, but this was special. This was James, his countryman. Captain Trowbridge was the next one up the ladder, climbing smoothly in spite of carrying her hat in her hand. As she swung her legs over the bulwark and dropped to the deck, she turned to look at Ian. She was a head shorter than him, skin and bones, he thought, but she held herself with a steadiness that made her a commanding presence. "Weathermaster," she said, "everything's ready for departure, I presume?" "Aye, ma'am. We can be underway as soon as you and Ang are settled." "Is everything all right?" "Splendid. The French king's hospitality was more than generous. I'm sorry you couldn't join us." The prince turned to them then. I too am sorry. I'm very grateful to you. London would be a difficult place for me to enter were it not for ones with talents such as yours. But as you know, the sauciers of weather may never set foot on French soil." "Aye, oui, monsieur," said Ian, his Scots accent mangling the French. "I understand. We all do." "Please tell me, how long will the voyage take?" "About 14 hours, said Ian. "Depends on the natural weather we encounter. No reason to whip up more wind than we must." "It is not a difficult voyage?" "We've done Versailles to London at least half a dozen times. Urgent messages, diplomats, perishable cargo. My team will follow the Seine through the night. I'll bring us over the Thames myself in the morning." "Cela est magnifique." "If you'll come this way," Captain Trowbridge said, "we thought you might enjoy the view from the quarterdeck as we depart." "Oui, madame. Merci beaucoup." She turned to the monk. "I'll see you shortly." "I shall prepare." Ang turned to leave with Chan at his heels, ducking through a doorway just under the quarterdeck. The passageway took them between officers' cabins on one side and guest quarters on the other, to the aft cabin that would have been the captain's on any surface vessel. Once inside, Ang settled himself onto a small dais to sit cross-legged, his back to the stern windows. He closed his eyes as Chan lit the coals in a small brazier. With the aroma of sandalwood beginning to suffuse the cabin, the acolyte sat on the floor facing him, adjusting his legs into the same cross-legged position. In unison, the two of them began to chant. On the quarterdeck above them, the prince cocked his head to one side. "Écoutez, entendez-vous cela?" he exclaimed. "Listen, do you hear it?" In the quiet of the night, the muffled voices from below were harsh, discordant, and alien, nothing like the plain-song of any Christian monk. Down on the main deck, the boatswain shouted the order for sails to be set, but only in the foremost of the three masts. Men at the bulwarks loosened the booms, lashed to either side of the ship. Others sang a shanty as they walked around the capstan, raising the anchors. Captain Trowbridge bowed to the prince. "If you'll excuse me, Monsignor, it's time to let the monk know we are ready." She retreated below to knock at the aft cabin. Chan opened the door for her. "Enter in peace," he said, stepping aside. "Peace be with thy spirit." She laid her hat on a small table and got down to sit facing Ang. His heartbeat had slowed, and his breaths were coming only about once a minute. He would not move again for the duration of the voyage. Trowbridge began to put aside all thoughts and all worry. This could only be done in a state of complete calm. Seated on a cushion, she closed her eyes, and as her body settled into deep relaxation, her awareness began to shift. The sounds around her, the smell of incense, the feeling of the floor beneath her, the physical sensations were still there, but they receded to the far edges of her mind. She could feel Ang Zhao's presence, as vivid as the radiant warmth of a fire. She felt others as well, the acolyte watching politely, the men on the quarterdeck overhead, others around the ship, but they were less distinct, while Ang grew steadily clearer. She found her mind beginning to resonate with his, as one string on a lute vibrates when the one next to it is plucked. She began to feel his thoughts, his smile. Through him, she could feel his awareness of the ship. She felt its mass, its weight, the pull of gravity, like the drag of water passing through a net. Rise, she told him wordlessly, and again, rise. She held the thought, focused her mind on it until Ang Zhao, sensing her mind, would also sense the thought, it is time to rise. Out on deck, Ian retreated to a spot on the forecastle where he wasn't in the way. Leaning on the forward railing, he looked up at the sky where the first stars twinkled, brilliant in the cold air. Then he closed his eyes and listened, though it wasn't exactly listening, and it wasn't sound he was trying to sense. He felt the air against his skin, and after a moment he could sense the air for yards around him. As his weather sense cleared, he could feel the temperatures for a mile or more in all directions, slightly warmer here over the ship, cooler out over the water, colder still over dry land. The air above was almost perfectly still. That was good. He would do his best to keep it that way until they had some loft. Winds at altitude were south by southwest, a gentle wind that would be easy enough to turn when he needed it. As the Pearl began to sit higher in the water, the boatswain stepped up onto the quarterdeck with a sextant, sighting along it to the roofline of the chateau. The Pearl kept rising, and in a moment the keel lifted from the water, leaving barely a ripple. When Fairbanks was sure they had at least 3 fathoms of clearance between the keel and the roof of the chateau, he shouted, "Set side sails!" Teams of men hauled on the martingales, spreading 40-foot booms until they were perpendicular to the hull. Once they were secured, sailors climbed out onto them, sliding their heels along the foot ropes to release the side sails. These hung down below the level of the keel, balancing all the canvas overhead and aligning the force of the wind with the ship's center of mass. Ian turned to face south, the direction from which he wanted to call up a wind. He closed his eyes again, took a deep breath, and reached out with his mind. He imagined what he did as stroking the air, almost like tickling a sleeping mastiff until it groans and pushes back, still asleep. He kept at it for a few minutes, and soon he heard the snap of canvas as the winds freshened and the sails filled. The Pearl drifted slowly northward over the treetops, ponderously coming about with her stern to the wind as her foresails billowed out. On the quarterdeck, the prince and his courtiers applauded politely. It was well and truly dark when the captain emerged from the monk's cabin. She scanned the deck, lit now by moonlight and lanterns, and walked up to Ian. "Report?" "I've called up a wind of about 40 knots, he told her. "We should reach London by mid-morn. Ariana's taken first watch. Josephus will relieve her at midnight." Ian glanced up at the mast-top, though the lone figure of Ariana was invisible against the night sky. "I've half a mind to stay up the night with them." "You don't trust your team?" "I trust them. It's only..." "What? There's something special about this voyage?" "He's the king." "The Prince of Wales, he being a little premature. Don't forget he still has Parliament to contend with." "You dinna legislate kings and queens." "England lives by the rule of law today. He'll be our king when, if Parliament sees fit to set aside their concerns about his religion." "He's the true king by divine right, and he's been my king since..." "Stop." The captain turned away from him. "I don't want to have this conversation again. He's our passenger, that's all." She was silent for a moment before facing him again. She fixed her eyes on him. "Your loyalty here is to your captain, and to the company, and to the crown, which at the moment sits on the head of our gracious Queen Anne. If running her errand to fetch her half-brother happens to coincide with your personal feelings, that's very nice for you, but I expect your best performance for every passenger we carry. Am I clear?" Ian's brow furrowed. "You have that always, Captain. You know it." "Very good." Her voice softened. "I'll be retiring once they've settled in for the night. We've had to move a few things around to accommodate his retinue, but my cabin is still available." Ian paused for a moment before responding. "Tonight?" he said at last. He looked toward the aft of the ship where the prince would be sleeping. "Weathermaster, if where you slept were ever a problem for the good order and discipline of this ship, you'd be sleeping ashore." "Aye," he said. She turned to leave. With her back to him, she said, "My cabin tonight. Or not, at your pleasure."